The stagecoach hit a rut deep enough to swallow a man's pride whole, and Ruby Wallace did not spill a single drop of the coffee. She had somehow convinced the driver to let her brew on the running board during the last rest stop, which told Harvey Dawson everything he needed to know about how wrong his first impression of her was going to turn out to be. He had seen her step off the eastbound stage in Laramie 2 days prior, and he had made up his mind in approximately 12 seconds. White gloves, a hat with actual silk ribbon, a trunk so heavy it had taken 2 men, and a considerable amount of creative language to haul it off the coach roof. Ruby Wallace had arrived in Wyoming territory in the spring of 1878, looking like someone had plucked her straight out of a parlor in Philadelphia and dropped her, entirely by accident, into a landscape that was doing its level best to be inhospitable. Harvey had been leaning against the post outside the general store, arms crossed, hat pulled low, watching the whole production with the quiet resignation of a man who had seen this kind of thing before and knew exactly how it ended. A woman like that would last 3 weeks at most, maybe 4 if the weather cooperated, which it would not, because this was Wyoming and the weather never cooperated with anybody. He had introduced himself because he had been paid to. Sam Greer, who owned the Rocking G Ranch 12 miles outside of town where Harvey served as foreman, had hired Ruby Wallace sight unseen as a cook and household manager after his previous cook had gone off and married a fur trapper and relocated to Montana without so much as a farewell pie. Sam was getting on in years and his eyesight was failing, and he had posted an advertisement in several newspapers back east describing a position of domestic employment in Wyoming territory with good wages and honest work. Ruby Wallace had answered the advertisement. Harvey had driven the wagon into Laramie to collect her, and standing there watching her survey the muddy main street of town with an expression that was not quite disgust but was certainly close enough to make the distinction irrelevant, he had thought with absolute certainty that this was a mistake. "Miss Wallace," he had said, touching the brim of his hat, "I'm Harvey Dawson. I work for Sam Greer." She had turned those dark brown eyes on him, direct and unblinking in a way he had not expected, and said, "Mr. Dawson, how far is the ranch?" 12 miles, he said. "Give or take." "Give or take what?" He had blinked at her. "Beg pardon. You said 12 miles, give or take." "Give or take what? Hills, river crossings, terrain that will make the journey longer or shorter than 12 miles by road measurement." She had tilted her head slightly. "I am asking because it will help me determine how to pack the wagon so the most fragile items are accessible in the event we need to stop and I need to redistribute weight." Harvey had stared at her for a long moment. Then he had said, 12 miles and a creek crossing, about an hour and a half. "Thank you," she had said, and turned back to direct the loading of her trunk with a calm precision that had made him feel, for reasons he could not entirely explain, slightly outmaneuvered. That had been 2 days ago. They had arrived at the Rocking G in the early evening light, with the hills turning gold and the first stars pressing through a purple sky, and Ruby had looked out at the sprawling ranch house and the outbuildings and the endless grass rippling in the wind, and Harvey had watched her face carefully, waiting for the moment when the reality of it settled in and the doubt crept through. But her expression had been thoughtful rather than frightened, interested rather than dismayed, and that had unsettled him more than dismay would have. Sam Greer had met them on the porch, a weathered old man with kind eyes and a handshake that still had some strength to it despite his 72 years. He had greeted Ruby with genuine warmth and showed her to the room that had been prepared for her, a small but decent room off the kitchen with a window that faced east so the morning light would come in clean. Ruby had thanked him with a courtesy that was genuine rather than performative, and Harvey had noted the subtle difference and felt unsettled again. He had expected complaints about the accommodations. There were none. He had expected questions about the indoor facilities, or rather the lack of certain indoor facilities that a woman from the East might consider essential. She asked practical questions instead about the water supply, the location of the root cellar, whether the kitchen stove had any particular temperament she should know about. "She drafts a little to the left when the wind comes from the north," Sam had told her, meaning the stove. "I will compensate," Ruby had said. Harvey had gone to bed that night in the bunkhouse with the nagging feeling that he had misjudged something, but he was not prepared to revise his opinion entirely based on one evening. First days were easy. The frontier had a way of revealing character gradually, like a river slowly wearing down stone, and the stone that looked hardest at first was often the first to crumble. He woke before dawn the next morning, as he always did, because the ranch did not wait on sleep. The hands needed direction, the horses needed tending, and the day's work started before the sun thought about getting up. He pulled on his boots in the dark of the bunkhouse, settled his hat on his head, and walked across the yard toward the main house because Sam had asked him to look in on the kitchen situation and make sure their new cook knew where everything was kept. What Harvey had expected to find when he pushed open the back door of the ranch house was a woman still asleep in her east-facing room, or perhaps just rising, confused and overwhelmed, standing in a dark kitchen she did not yet know how to navigate. What he found instead was a kitchen that already smelled like heaven. Ruby Wallace was standing at the stove in a work dress that was considerably more practical than anything he had seen her wearing the day before, her dark hair pinned up neatly, an apron tied at her waist with efficient precision, and she was managing four things simultaneously with the focused calm of someone who had long since made peace with the idea that mornings required concentration. There was a cast iron pan on the stove with bacon beginning to render and hiss in its own fat. There was a pot of coffee already finished and sitting on the edge of the stove keeping warm, because she had clearly been up long enough to brew a pot and move on to the next task. There was a bowl on the table with biscuit dough in it, resting under a clean cloth, and she was in the process of cracking eggs into a second pan with a one-handed efficiency that would have impressed a professional kitchen in New York City. She did not look up when he came in, but she spoke. "The coffee is ready," she said. "The cups are on the second shelf left side. And before you say whatever you came in here to say, Mr. Dawson, the answer is yes. I was aware the stove drafts to the left, and no, it did not give me any trouble." Harvey stood in the doorway with his hat in his hand and said absolutely nothing for a full 10 seconds. "I also found your supply situation somewhat alarming," she continued, sliding the eggs in the pan with a practiced tilt of the wrist, "and I have made a list of what needs to be ordered from town. I left it on the table by the door. You will want to go over it with Mr. Greer before the next supply run." She reached for the coffee pot without looking, poured a cup with the ease of someone who had located it by feel, and set it on the counter near him. "The biscuits will be ready in 30 minutes. Bacon in 15. If you want your eggs a particular way, you should tell me now." Harvey took the coffee cup because it seemed like the only appropriate response to the situation. He took a sip. It was very good coffee, better than anything the ranch hands had been producing for themselves, that was certain. "Scrambled," he said, because she was waiting for an answer. "Fine." She turned finally and looked at him, and there was something in her expression that was not quite amusement and not quite challenge, but contained elements of both. "Was there something you needed from me, or did you come in to observe?" "I came in to make sure you knew where things were," he said. "I found where things were," she said. "I woke up at 4 in the morning and learned the kitchen. I prefer to know where things are before I need them." "You woke up at 4 in the morning?" "Yes." "Your first morning here?" "Yes." She turned back to the stove, adjusted the heat under the bacon with the confident hand of someone who had been doing this for years. "Did you think I would sleep until noon?" He had thought something not entirely unlike that if he was being honest, which he was not going to be. "I thought you might need time to adjust." "I adjust by working," she said simply. "It is how I have always been made." Harvey drank his coffee and watched her move around the kitchen with a competence that was quietly stunning, and he thought about how he had looked at her standing on that muddy street in Laramie with her white gloves and her silk ribboned hat, and decided in 12 seconds that he knew who she was. He thought about how thoroughly wrong 12 seconds had turned out to be. She set a plate in front of him 20 minutes later, before the hands were even up, before Sam had come down from his room, before the ranch had truly stirred itself into wakefulness. Scrambled eggs, cooked through but not dry. Bacon crisp but not burnt. And when the biscuits came out of the oven at exactly the 30-minute mark she had promised, golden and properly risen, the smell of them was enough to bring two of the ranch hands stumbling through the kitchen door, still pulling their suspenders up. Ruby Wallace stood at her stove on her first morning at the Rocking G Ranch in Wyoming Territory in the spring of 1878, and she fed every person in that house before the sun had fully cleared the eastern hills. And she did it with the same quiet efficiency with which she had apparently done everything else in her life. And Harvey Dawson sat at that kitchen table with his second cup of excellent coffee and understood that he had been comprehensively wrong about her. The understanding did not arrive gently. It arrived the way most significant understandings arrive in a man's life, with a faint embarrassment at the assumption that had preceded it, and a sharp clarity about what was actually true. What was actually true was that Ruby Wallace was going to be perfectly fine on the frontier. What was less clear, and what would take considerably longer to work out, was what Harvey Dawson was going to do about the way she had looked at him over the rim of her coffee cup with those direct, unblinking dark eyes, as though she could see straight through the crossed arms and the flat expression, and the carefully maintained distance to whatever was actually underneath. He was not accustomed to being seen, and he found he was not sure whether the sensation was pleasant or alarming. He suspected it might be both. The weeks that followed settled into the rhythms that all ranch life settles into eventually, those deep grooves worn by necessity and repetition, until they become something close to comfort. Ruby established herself in the kitchen and the household with a thorough, methodical competence that the ranch hands quickly recognized and respected. She was not soft, and she was not fragile, and she did not pretend to be either of those things. She learned to ride within her first week, not because anyone asked her to, but because she had assessed the situation and determined that a person who could not ride in this country was at a disadvantage, and Ruby Wallace did not care for disadvantages. She asked old Tom Haskell, the most experienced of the ranch hands, to teach her, and she did it with a directness that Tom clearly appreciated, because Tom was not a man who had much patience for people who danced around what they wanted. "You've sat a horse before," Tom told her after her first lesson, with the grudging approval of a man who does not give approval easily. "I rode in the East," she said. "Side saddle." I understood it was impractical here. "It is," Tom confirmed. "Then I will not be doing it side saddle," she said, and that was the end of that. Harvey watched from a distance that he told himself was professional, and that was actually something considerably more complicated than professional. He watched her ride, sitting the horse with a careful concentration that gradually relaxed into something more instinctive. He watched her walk out to the garden plot she had asked Sam's permission to establish and dig up the earth with her own hands, the white gloves long since exchanged for a pair of good leather-work gloves from the general store in town. He watched her during the thunderstorm that came through in the second week, when the sky turned a particular shade of green that meant serious weather, and everyone on the ranch was moving fast to secure livestock and equipment. Ruby had been in the middle of bread making when the storm came in, and she had assessed the situation, covered her dough, and come outside to help bring the horses into the barn with a calm efficiency that had kept two of the younger hands from panicking when the thunder hit close and the horses started pulling at their leads. "Talk to them," she had told young Pete, who was 17 and had not been working horses long enough to trust himself when they were frightened. "They cannot hear the storm over their own fear. You have to give them something else to listen to." Pete had talked to his horse in a low, steady stream of words, the content irrelevant and the tone everything, and the horse had settled. Harvey had seen it from across the barn and felt something in his chest shift in a way he was not ready to name. He had grown up on ranches in Texas and moved north to Wyoming 7 years ago, following work the way a man follows water in dry country, going where it was and staying until the next place called him on. He was 31 years old, solidly built from a decade and more of physical labor, quiet by nature and practical by necessity, and he had long since made a kind of peace with the idea that his life was going to be defined by work rather than by sentiment. He had seen too many men undone by sentiment in this country. The frontier was not a place that had much patience for soft feelings. He had told himself that often enough and believed it thoroughly enough that he had stopped questioning it, until Ruby Wallace arrived and started quietly, methodically, entirely without apparent effort, dismantling the neat and tidy wall of certainty he had built around himself. It was not dramatic. That was the thing about it that Harvey found most disorienting. He was prepared for drama he knew how to handle. A beautiful woman in obvious distress, overwhelmed by the harshness of the land, looking to someone capable and steady for rescue. He knew that story and he knew his part in it, and he knew exactly how to maintain the appropriate distance. But Ruby was not in distress. Ruby was never in distress. Ruby arrived at every situation already in the process of solving it, and she did not look at Harvey Dawson as though he were a potential rescuer. She looked at him as though he were a person of equal standing whose opinion she was interested in hearing, when she happened to be curious about it. The morning in the third week when he came into the kitchen to find her studying a map she had drawn herself, with distances marked out in careful notation, and the positions of neighboring ranches and water sources indicated, he stopped in the doorway and looked at it for a long moment. "What is this?" he asked. "A map of the area as I understand it so far," she said. "I have gaps. I was hoping you might fill them in. I want to know the land I am living on." He sat down across from her and looked at the map more carefully. It was surprisingly accurate for someone who had been here less than a month. She had the creek crossings right, and the direction of the prevailing winds indicated in a small notation in the corner, and she had marked what she understood to be the property lines of the rocking G in firm pencil. "You are off here," he said, putting his finger on a spot in the southern section. "The property line runs closer to that ridge, and this creek is seasonal. It runs good in spring but dries to nothing by July." She made a note in the margin. "And the McAllister Ranch, is this the right direction?" "Southeast, you have it close." He looked at her. "Why do you want to know about the McAllister Ranch?" "I do not want to wander onto someone else's land by accident," she said. "Out here, I understand that is the kind of mistake that can have serious consequences." "It can," he agreed. She had heard things, he realized. She had been paying attention since the day she arrived, listening to the hands talk at the table, asking Sam questions in the evenings, building a picture of the world she had moved into with the same careful, methodical attention she brought to everything else. She was not just surviving the frontier. She was studying it. "The land between the Rocking G and the Broken Bow Ranch to the north is contested," he said before he had entirely decided to say it. "Has been for 2 years. Bill Thornton, who owns the Broken Bow, claims his eastern fence line should extend further south than Sam has it marked. It is not a resolved situation." Ruby looked at him steadily. "Is it likely to become a problem?" "It could," he said honestly. "Thornton is the kind of man who tends to push on things." She added another note to her map. "Thank you," she said. "That is useful to know." He sat there longer than he needed to, talking her through the geography and the local complications, and the way the land worked in different seasons. And she listened with the concentrated attention of someone who intends to retain every word. And the conversation was entirely practical in its content, and something altogether different in its feeling. And when he finally stood up and went out to start the day's work, he carried the warmth of it with him for hours without quite knowing why. The situation with Bill Thornton and the contested land came to a head in the 4th week, which was earlier than Harvey had expected. Thornton showed up at the ranch on a Tuesday morning with 2 of his men, riding up the lane with the kind of deliberate slowness that was meant to communicate that he owned every inch of ground his horse was crossing, which he did not, and dismounting in the yard with a broad, confident air that Harvey recognized as the posture of a man who was accustomed to getting what he wanted by making the alternative seem unpleasant. Sam came out on the porch, moving with the careful dignity of an old man who was not going to be rushed by anyone, and Harvey positioned himself in the yard with his thumbs in his belt and his hat pulled to a working angle and waited. "Sam," Thornton said, by way of greeting that was not quite a greeting. "Bill," Sam said, by way of response that held exactly the same quality. "I want to talk about that fence line again." "We have talked about it," Sam said. "My position has not changed." Thornton looked around the yard with the appraising eye of a man conducting an inventory rather than a visit. His gaze moved over the bunkhouse and the barn and the garden that Ruby had established in the south corner of the yard, and then it moved to the kitchen door, where Ruby had appeared with a dish towel over her shoulder, drawn by the sound of horses. Thornton looked at her with the kind of attention that Harvey found immediately and intensely objectionable. "You hired on new help," Thornton said. "I hired a cook and household manager," Sam said. "Which is my business, Bill." Thornton tilted his head in Ruby's direction. "Awful fine for this country," he said, which was addressed to Sam but was clearly meant for Ruby to hear. Ruby looked at Thornton with an expression of such complete neutrality that it was itself a form of response. She said nothing. She simply looked at him with those direct, dark eyes and waited, in the way she waited for things, as though time was entirely her ally, and she had nothing but patience at her disposal. Thornton seemed to find the neutrality more discomfiting than any words she might have offered. He shifted his weight slightly and turned his attention back to Sam. The conversation about the fence line went nowhere, because Sam was a man of considerable experience in not being moved, and Thornton eventually remounted with his men and left with the fence line exactly where it had been before he arrived. Harvey watched him go with the careful attention of a man who does not fully turn his back on a problem that has only been postponed rather than resolved. That evening after supper, Sam sat on the porch in his usual chair, and Harvey sat on the step, and Ruby came out with 3 cups of coffee and sat herself on the other end of the step with the comfortable ease of someone who had decided that being part of the conversation was appropriate and was not asking permission for it, because she rarely asked permission for things she had already determined were reasonable. "He will be back," Sam said. "He will," Harvey agreed. "He has always wanted this land," Sam said. "When my wife was alive, he did not push as hard, because Margaret had a way of making men feel small when they tried to take what was not theirs. She was good at that." "When did you lose her?" Ruby asked. 4 years ago," Sam said, "and the grief in it was old and settled and still present in the way old grief always is. She was a remarkable woman." "She sounds it," Ruby said. They sat in the evening quiet for a while, and the stars came out in their Wyoming abundance, the kind of sky that the East never offered, too wide and too brilliant to be anything but humbling, and Harvey looked at it and felt, as he often did, the particular mix of insignificance and freedom that the open sky reliably produced. "I would like to suggest something," Ruby said. "Go ahead," Sam said. "The fence line dispute is about documentation as much as anything," she said. "Do you have your original survey records?" Sam was quiet for a moment. "I do, somewhere. If you found them and had them properly organized and available, you would have documentation that would be difficult for Thornton to argue against. A surveyed record is harder to contest than a verbal claim." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "My father was a land attorney in Philadelphia before he retired. I grew up understanding how these disputes work. The man with the clearest documentation generally prevails." There was a moment of silence, and then Sam laughed, a genuine and delighted sound. "A land attorney," he said. "Well now, I am not an attorney," Ruby said. "But I am my father's daughter," and he was thorough. Harvey looked at her in the blue evening light, and thought that he was going to have to entirely reconstruct whatever idea he had had about who Ruby Wallace was, because apparently she was going to keep adding dimensions to herself until the original impression was unrecognizable. The survey records were found after a morning of organized searching in which Ruby took charge of Sam's filing system, with the restrained horror of someone discovering a situation more serious than expected, and the calm determination to address it properly. She organized 2 years of accumulated paperwork into a coherent system within a single day, and when she located the original survey documents from when Sam had filed his land claim, she laid them out on the kitchen table with the satisfaction of someone finding exactly what they needed exactly where a thorough search would eventually reveal it. Harvey studied the documents alongside her, and the survey lines were clear and unambiguous, and the fence line as Sam had it built was entirely correct. "We should have these copied," Ruby said, "and the copies kept separately in case of fire or other damage. One set with the originals, one set that can go to the territorial office for registration." "You know about territorial registration?" Harvey asked. "I know about documentation," she said, "and I know that a document kept in one place is only as safe as that one place." He looked at her across the kitchen table with the survey document spread between them, and the morning light was coming through the east window the way she had told him it would on her first day, clean and direct, and it lit the side of her face and caught in her dark eyes. And Harvey Dawson thought something he had been carefully not thinking for 4 weeks, which was that Ruby Wallace was one of the most capable and interesting people he had ever met, and that the feeling of sitting across a table from her working on a problem together was one of the finest feelings he could recently recall. He did not say any of that because he was Harvey Dawson, and Harvey Dawson did not say things like that. He said, "I can ride into Laramie Thursday with the copies." "Good," she said, and looked back at the documents, and he could see the corner of her mouth tucking up in a way that meant she was aware of a great deal more than she was saying, and he suspected she had been aware of it for longer than he had. The summer that year was a Wyoming summer in full character, hot and bright and windy, with sudden storms that came up from nowhere and just as quickly disappeared, leaving the air washed clean and the grass sparkling, and the sky that particular blue that looked painted. Ruby's garden produced with a generosity that appeared to surprise everyone except Ruby, who had planted it with the same careful intention she applied to everything, and seemed to expect results proportional to effort, because in her experience they generally were. She put up preserves in the kitchen in the middle of July, working through the hottest days with the windows open and the steam from the canning pots rolling around her, and she never once complained about the heat or looked as though she wanted to. She traded seeds and preserving advice with the women of the neighboring ranch families when they came to call, establishing connections across the scattered community of ranching families with a natural ease that Harvey watched with a kind of wondering admiration. The women of the frontier were not always easy on newcomers, particularly not on women from back east who arrived with silk-ribboned hats and were perceived to be looking down on a life that those women had built with their hands and their endurance through conditions that the East could not imagine. But Ruby did not look down on anything. She asked genuine questions. She listened to the answers. When Martha Colby from the neighboring Colby Ranch told her about the winter 2 years previous that had taken 40% of the area's cattle, Ruby sat and listened to the whole of it without rushing toward comfort or reassurance, because she had understood somehow that the telling of it was what was needed, not the solution. "That woman is something else," Martha Colby told her husband afterward, and her husband told it to Harvey when he ran into him at the general store. And Harvey said, "Yes," with a simplicity and a certainty that caused the older man to look at him with the knowing expression of someone who recognizes a particular kind of certainty and understands exactly what it means. Harvey rode back to the ranch that day with the supplies in the wagon bed and the dry, warm wind in his face, and the long grass rolling beside the road in silver waves. And he thought about what he was going to do about the thing that had been growing in him since the morning he walked into the kitchen and found the coffee ready, and the eggs on the stove, and Ruby Wallace managing the frontier, as though she had been doing it her entire life. The problem, as he understood it, was this. He had been wrong about her from the beginning, and he had let her see that he was wrong about her, not in words but in the way that people see each other when they are paying attention. And Ruby had let him be wrong and then let him discover his wrongness on his own without making him feel small about it, which was itself an act of considerable grace that he had not missed and had not forgotten. And now they worked alongside each other in the daily life of the ranch, with an ease and a comfort that felt to Harvey like something he had not known before and did not want to give up. And that feeling had a name, and he knew the name, and the name frightened him in the way that things frighten people, not because they are bad, but because they matter too much for a man to be casual about. He was 31 years old, and he had spent his adult life moving through this country with his hands and his skills and his quiet competence, and he had told himself that was enough and had believed it. And then Ruby Wallace had walked into his life and started making a home in it with the same practical, graceful efficiency with which she made a home everywhere she went, and suddenly enough was not sufficient anymore. The trouble was that Ruby was employed by Sam Greer, and Harvey worked for Sam Greer, and they were living in close quarters on a small ranch, and the rules of propriety that existed even in frontier communities existed for reasons that were not entirely unreasonable, and Harvey was a man who had always operated within understood boundaries. He did not know how to step outside the boundary he had built between himself and Ruby Wallace, without making it awkward for everyone, particularly without making it awkward for Ruby herself, who had come here to work and deserved to be able to do her work without her employer's foreman making himself inconvenient. He was thinking all of this in the barn on a Thursday evening in August while he was rubbing down his horse after the ride back from town, and he was so thoroughly occupied with his thinking that he did not hear Ruby come into the barn until she spoke. "I have 2 extra biscuits from supper," she said, "and I thought you might want them since you missed the meal." He turned around. She was standing in the barn doorway with the last of the evening light behind her, holding a cloth-wrapped bundle, and she was wearing a pale blue work dress with her sleeves rolled up because she had been washing dishes, and her hair was coming down a little at the back where it always escaped its pins by evening. And she was looking at him with those calm, direct eyes, and there was nothing calculated about her expression whatsoever, and that was somehow more disarming than anything calculated could have been. "Thank you," he said. She came in and set the bundle on the edge of the stall rail and stood there a moment, and she said, "Are you all right? You have had something on your mind for a while." "I am fine," he said. She tilted her head very slightly, which was her tell, the small movement that indicated she was considering whether to push or let something rest. She appeared to decide to push gently. "Harvey," she said, and the use of his first name, which she had been using for weeks and which still caught him somewhere in the chest every time, "you are a careful man, careful with your words and careful with yourself. I respect that. But I have noticed something, and I think I would rather have us talk about it plainly than go on not talking about it." He looked at her. "What have you noticed?" She held his gaze without wavering. "That you look at me differently than you did when I arrived," she said, "and that you find reasons to be wherever I am, and I notice that because I do the same thing, and I think we are both too practical to spend the rest of the summer inventing reasons when the actual reason is fairly clear." Harvey Dawson stood in his barn in the last of the August light and understood that Ruby Wallace had just done, with perfect calm and absolute clarity, the thing he had been trying to figure out how to do for 2 months. She had simply said the true thing. "I was wrong about you," he said, "from the beginning." "I know," she said. "I forgave you for it before the coffee was finished on the first morning." He laughed, and it surprised him, the way a genuine laugh always does when it comes from somewhere real. "You could have said something sooner. You needed to figure it out yourself, she said simply. Some things cannot be told, they have to be discovered. He looked at her for a long moment, and the barn was warm and smelled of horse and hay and the late summer evening outside, and he said, "Ruby, I would like to court you properly. If that is something you would want." She looked at him with those dark eyes, and the corner of her mouth tucked up in the way it did when she was aware of more than she was saying. "Harvey Dawson," she said, "I have been waiting for you to get around to that question since approximately the third week." He crossed the barn in 2 strides and took her hands in his, and they were strong hands, he noticed, not the soft gloved hands he had imagined in Laramie, but hands that had worked this summer, toughened by honest labor, and they were entirely right in his. Courting Ruby Wallace turned out to be one of the more vivid experiences of Harvey Dawson's adult life. Not because she was difficult or coy or played the games that courtship sometimes devolved into, but because she was herself with him in a way that required him to be himself in return. And Harvey discovered that being actually known by another person was an experience he had been avoiding for a long time without clearly understanding that he had been avoiding it. She asked him about his history, and he told her about growing up in Texas and his father's ranch, and the drought that had broken the land and the family together when Harvey was 15, and the years after that moving through the West finding work where it was. And she listened to all of it with the attention she gave to everything important. He asked her about Philadelphia, about her father, the land attorney, and her mother, who he gathered had been a formidable woman in her own right. And she told him, and he listened. And in the listening, he understood more about who she was and why she had arrived on the frontier and learned it like a language she had always wanted to speak. "Why did you answer Sam's advertisement?" he asked her one evening, sitting on the porch in the September air that was beginning to have a bite to it. She was quiet for a moment, thinking it through honestly rather than reaching for the easy answer. "Because I wanted to go somewhere real," she said finally. "Philadelphia is a fine city, and I had a good life there, but everything was already decided. The world I lived in was already arranged. Who I was allowed to be was already largely determined. And I did not think the arrangement was wrong exactly, but I thought there might be more of me than it had room for." He looked at her in the porch light. "And is there?" She smiled, and it was the full version of the smile she rarely deployed, but which, when she did, was enough to make a man feel the ground shift under his feet. "I can ride a horse," she said. "I can read a survey document. I can manage a wood stove in a Wyoming wind, and I can garden in hard soil, and I put up 40 jars of preserves this summer. And apparently I can figure out how to get an obstinate foreman to admit he has feelings, which might be the most frontier skill of the lot." He laughed again, that genuine surprised laugh that she had been pulling out of him with increasing regularity, and that he was beginning to understand she was doing on purpose, because she found it, she had told him once, her favorite sound. The fall came in earnest in October, with the cold arriving on the back of a northern wind that had real intent to it, and the ranch shifted into the patterns of fall preparation, cutting and storing feed, checking fences and structures before the winter's harder tests, laying in supplies with a careful calculation of how far the cold months might extend. Harvey drove into Laramie twice for major supply runs and took Ruby with him both times, partly because she had a more organized method of supply procurement than anyone else on the ranch, and partly because having her beside him on the wagon seat for 12 miles in each direction, talking or sometimes not talking but comfortable in either mode, was something he had discovered he did not want to give up. On the second trip in November, with the first light snow on the hills and the sky that particular flat gray of winter approaching, he stopped the wagon at the edge of town and reached into his coat pocket and brought out a small box that he had acquired at the jeweler's 3 weeks prior and had been carrying since. Waiting for the right moment, and then questioning whether any moment would feel right enough, and finally deciding that the question of right moments was probably one of those things that could be thought about indefinitely or simply resolved. "Ruby," he said. She looked at him with the settled attention she had always given him, and he could see in her eyes that she had already understood where this was going, because she was Ruby, and she understood where things were going well in advance of their arrival. "I know we have not been courting long," he said, "and I know that by the standards of the world you came from, this is probably moving at a speed that would cause eyebrows to be raised in several directions. But I also know that I have never in my life met anyone like you, and I know what I want, and I know it clearly enough that waiting feels like a particular kind of foolishness I do not intend to be guilty of." He opened the box. The ring inside was a simple gold band with a small garnet stone, dark red and honest and nothing extravagant. "Would you do me the honor of marrying me?" Ruby Wallace looked at the ring for a moment, and then she looked at Harvey Dawson with those dark eyes that had been seeing him clearly since the first morning in the kitchen, and she said, "Yes. Obviously yes. I have been yes since August." He put the ring on her finger, right there on the wagon seat outside Laramie, Wyoming territory, with the light snow starting to fall and the horses breathing steam into the cold air and the vast gray sky above them. And she leaned over and kissed him on the cheek with the warmth of someone who has decided exactly what she wants, and is not the slightest bit uncertain about the wisdom of wanting it. And he turned and kissed her properly, with the full and genuine feeling of a man who has stopped trying to be careful and is simply, finally, being real. They told Sam that evening. Sam, who had watched the whole thing unfold over 4 months with the patient satisfaction of a man who has arranged things correctly and is waiting for others to catch up, said, "Well, it is about time," and got up and went to the cupboard where he kept the good whiskey and poured 3 glasses. They married in December, in the small church in Laramie, with Tom Haskell and young Pete, and the other hands from the Rocking G in the pews and Martha Colby, and several of the other ranching women, with the kind of warm, approving attention that women bring to weddings they have been anticipating. Sam walked Ruby down the aisle because her father was too far away to travel in December, and he did it with the dignity of a man who was proud of the role. Ruby wore a dress she had made herself over the course of October and November, deep green wool with cream at the collar, practical and beautiful in the way everything about her was practical and beautiful, and she walked toward Harvey with the same direct, unblinking calm she had brought to every other moment in her life. And he stood at the front of that small church in his best coat and watched her come, and thought that there was no previous moment in his life that had prepared him for this one. And that was entirely fitting, because there was no one else in his life who had been Ruby Wallace. The words were said and the ring was settled permanently, and they walked out into the December cold as Harvey and Ruby Dawson, and the sky overhead was clear and brilliant, and the snow on the distant hills was white and clean, and she tucked her hand through his arm and looked up at him and said, "What do we do now?" "Now," he said, "we go home." The winter they spent together in those first married months was the kind of winter that tests everything, as Wyoming winters are designed to do. It came in hard in January, with temperatures that dropped well past what a person from the east would have thought possible, and storms that kept the ranch hands in the bunkhouse for 3 days running, while the wind outside made the kind of sound that a landscape makes when it has decided to remind everyone of who is actually in charge. Harvey was everywhere during those storms, out in the worst of it, checking on the livestock, making sure the structures held, managing the hands through the weather with the experience of a man who had seen hard winters before and knew the difference between dangerous and merely uncomfortable. Ruby kept the main house warm and the food steady, but she was not merely managing the domestic sphere while the men dealt with the outdoor crisis. She was out twice herself, once to help secure the barn door that had lost a hinge in the wind, and was banging with a violence that was going to cause structural damage if it went on, and once with a lantern and heavy wool coat to bring Harvey and 2 of the hands hot coffee and food during the second full day of the worst storm, when it had been hours since anyone had come inside. Harvey found her in the barn doorway that second time, snow in her hair and the lantern burning steady in her hand despite the wind, and the coffee she handed him was still hot because she had carried it wrapped in a cloth under her coat to protect it. "You should not be out in this," he said. "You have been out in this for 11 hours, she said. "So should is a relative term." He drank the coffee and looked at her in the lantern light, and felt the love he had for her like something solid and warm in the center of his chest, something that the weather outside could not touch. Spring came eventually, as it always does, regardless of how thoroughly winter has seemed to take up permanent residence. The land thawed and the creek ran high, and the grass came back with the green confidence of things that know they will return. Ruby's garden went in earlier than the previous year because she knew the soil better now and knew exactly when it was ready. Bill Thornton made one more attempt at the fence line dispute in March, this time coming with a document he claimed was a survey that supported his position. Sam sent for a land surveyor from Cheyenne, which Ruby had quietly suggested months before as the appropriate resolution, and the surveyor arrived in April and conducted a thorough examination of the land and the records, including the organized and properly filed original survey documents that Ruby had found and had copied and registered the previous fall. The surveyor's finding was unambiguous. The Rocking G's fence line was correctly placed. Thornton's claim was without basis in the documented record. Thornton accepted the finding with poor grace but accepted it nonetheless, because a man can contest a neighbor's word but he cannot reasonably contest a professional surveyor's documented finding without going to the territorial court. And whatever Thornton was, he was not stupid enough to take a case he had already lost once before a judge. When the surveyor rode away and the dispute was settled, Sam sat on the porch that evening with his usual coffee and said to Ruby, "I owe you for that." "You owe me nothing," she said. "It was your land, I simply helped you prove it." "That is not nothing," Sam said quietly. "Not at my age with my eyes failing the way they are. Not without someone to help me see what I need to see." He paused. "I am glad you answered my advertisement, Miss Ruby. Mrs. Dawson, I am very glad." Ruby reached over and patted his weathered hand once with the warmth of someone who meant it completely. By the summer of 1879, the Rocking G felt thoroughly different from the ranch Harvey had managed alone for the years before Ruby arrived. Not because she had changed what it was, but because she had added to it in ways that compounded in unexpected directions. The ranch hands ate better and were, as a result, marginally better tempered than ranch hands generally tended to be. The household ran with an organized efficiency that Sam's aging eyes and health genuinely needed. The garden produced, the preserves lined the cellar shelves, and the relationships with the neighboring ranching families were warmer than they had been in years, because Ruby had an instinct for community that the isolated life of ranching tended to starve. She had also, in the quietly purposeful way she did everything, begun to teach young Pete to read. Pete had grown up without proper schooling, which was common enough in this country, and could read at a level that was adequate for basic purposes but not much beyond. Ruby had noticed, without making it obvious that she had noticed, and had one evening simply set a book on the table near him, and said that if he ever wanted to work through it she would be glad to help. And Pete had picked it up with the careful interest of someone who wanted something, but had been told by circumstances not to want it. And they had worked through it over several months, evenings at the kitchen table, while Ruby kept her hands busy with mending or preparation for the next day. Harvey had come in one evening to find Pete reading out loud from the book, with a fluency he had not had 3 months before, and Ruby listening with the patient attention of a woman who understood that learning was not a favor she was doing someone, but a right she was helping them claim. Harvey had stood in the doorway and watched and not said anything, and later in the evening when the hands were all back in the bunkhouse, and it was just the two of them in the kitchen with the lamp burning low, he had said, "You are a remarkable person." Ruby had looked up from her mending with something like surprise, because he did not often make declarations of that kind in such direct terms. "Am I?" "Yes," he said, unambiguously. She put down the mending and looked at him steadily across the kitchen table. "You are not so ordinary yourself, Harvey Dawson," she said. "You see everything. You think you are closed, but you see everything, and you do not use what you see against people. That is rarer than you think." He looked back at her, and the lamplight was between them, and the ranch was quiet outside, and the world beyond the window was enormous and wild, and full of the particular freedom that this country offered to people willing to engage with it honestly. And he understood that this was his life, this woman across the table, this work, this land, and that it was, beyond any measure he would have applied to his own future 10 years ago, entirely enough. In the early fall of 1879, Ruby told Harvey over breakfast on a Wednesday morning that they were going to need to think about arrangements. He looked at her. "What arrangements?" "The practical kind," she said. "You will need to discuss with Sam whether the foreman's quarters might be expanded, or whether there is another way to solve the space issue. And the arrangements in general will need to be thought through before February." He looked at her for another moment, and then he understood what she was saying, and a feeling came up in him that was too large for the kitchen table and too real to be anything but the truest thing he had ever felt. "February," he said. "Approximately," she said, with the small precision she brought to everything, and was looking at him with the full warmth of someone who had known she was going to enjoy this moment, and is finding that the anticipation was entirely accurate. He stood up from the breakfast table and went around it and took her hands and held them and looked at her. And he did not have words that were adequate, so he did not try to produce them. And she seemed to understand that from his expression, because she simply looked back at him with those dark eyes full of warmth and something close to joy. And the morning light was coming through the east window clean and straight, the way it always did. Sam was told that evening and wept a little, which he would have denied thoroughly if pressed on it, claiming allergies to something seasonal, and then recovered his composure and told Harvey that the question of space was a good one, and he had been thinking for a while that the house had more room than an old man with failing eyes needed, and the time had come for a conversation about the future. The conversation they had that evening on the porch, all three of them, with the fall air cold and clear and the stars coming out over the Wyoming hills, was the kind of conversation that changes the shape of lives. Sam wanted to formalize what had been informally true for some time, which was that Harvey was not merely the foreman of the Rocking G, but its actual ongoing manager. And in that capacity, it was appropriate and reasonable that Harvey and Ruby should move into the main house properly, taking the larger rooms, while Sam kept his own room and his porch chair and his evenings with good company. And the ranch continued to run under Harvey's management with a formal arrangement that reflected the reality of who was actually sustaining it. "The land will be yours eventually," Sam said simply. "I have no family to leave it to, and I have known that for years. When I go, it goes to you both. That is how I want it, and I have already spoken to the attorney in town about the paperwork. I am telling you now because I want you to know while I am still here to know it with you." Harvey did not know what to say to that. Ruby, with her characteristic ability to find the right response when Harvey could not, leaned over and put her hand on Sam's arm and said, "Thank you, Sam. It will be cared for." "I know it will," he said. "That is why I am not worried about it." The baby was born in February, as Ruby had calculated with her usual accuracy, on a cold, bright morning when the snow outside was hard-packed, and the sky was that particular brilliant winter blue. Harvey was there, because there was nowhere else on earth he could have been persuaded to be, and the woman who served the area as midwife, a sturdy and experienced woman named Mrs. Beaumont, who had delivered half the children born within 30 miles of Laramie in the past 15 years, managed the whole thing with a calm competence that Ruby had clearly approved of from the moment they met. The baby was a boy, strong-lunged and dark-haired, born into a warm room in a ranch house that was already a real home by every measure that mattered. Harvey held his son for the first time with the careful arms of a man who has suddenly discovered that something exists that he would do absolutely anything to protect, and looked at Ruby, who was tired in the deep and satisfied way of someone who has done something enormous, and said, "What do we name him?" "Samuel," Ruby said, "if you agree." Harvey looked at her, and at his son, and at the name that was a tribute to the old man in the next room who was pretending he had not been listening anxiously through the wall for the past several hours. "Samuel," he agreed. They heard, from the other side of the wall, a sound that might have been a tired old man exhaling with relief, or might have been something more, and neither of them commented on it because some things are better honored by silence. Sam Greer held his namesake that afternoon with hands that trembled a little with age and perhaps with something else, and looked at the baby with the expression of a man who has been given something he had not known he was missing, and said, to no one in particular, "Good. This is very good." The years that followed were full in the way that a life built from real work and genuine love is full, not without difficulty, because nothing of value comes without difficulty, but with the kind of ongoing richness that difficulty cannot touch when the foundation is solid. Little Samuel grew into a serious, observant boy who had his mother's dark eyes and his father's quiet attention, and who followed Harvey around the ranch from the time he could walk with the determined focus of a very small person who has decided where he belongs. He learned the horses before he learned to read, and then learned to read with an enthusiasm that suggested Ruby's patient teaching approach had found its most receptive student yet. The ranch grew over those years. Harvey negotiated the purchase of additional grazing land to the east, the kind of careful, methodical expansion that a man makes when he knows the land and respects it, and is planning not for the next season, but for the next generation. Ruby managed the household and the domestic economy of the ranch with the same organized intelligence she had brought from the first morning, and expanded her sphere in directions that the original advertisement had never anticipated. She became, quietly and without title, a resource for the other ranching women in the area on questions of preservation and supply and health, and occasionally, the kind of document organization and record-keeping that her father's professional influence had given her a firm grounding in. She corresponded with her family in Philadelphia regularly, and in the spring of 1882, with little Samuel 3 years old and capable of charming anyone he met with a combination of his mother's directness and his father's steady calm, her parents made the journey west to visit. Her father, a tall man with silver at his temples and the observant eyes of someone accustomed to reading situations accurately, spent 3 days on the ranch and then took Harvey aside on the 4th morning and said, in the direct manner of a man who does not see the use of circumlocution, "You are not what I imagined when Ruby wrote to tell me she was marrying a ranch foreman in Wyoming. What did you imagine?" Harvey asked. "Something rougher," her father said, with a small, precise smile that Harvey recognized as where Ruby had gotten it, "and something less. She has a way of finding people who are more than they appear. She has always had it. I should have trusted it from the beginning instead of worrying for 2 years. She has given me more than I can account for," Harvey said honestly. Her father looked at him for a long moment with the assessing eyes of a man who has spent his career reading truth in documents and situations. "I can see that," he said, "and I can see she has done the same." Ruby's parents stayed for 2 weeks and left charmed by Wyoming and thoroughly at peace about their daughter's life, which was everything Ruby had hoped for, and which she told Harvey so. That last evening after her parents' wagon had gone down the lane toward Laramie, and the dust had settled, and they were sitting on the porch in the early summer evening with Samuel asleep inside. "She is happy," her mother had whispered to her at the moment of farewell, looking around at the ranch, the garden, the hills, the vast open sky. "Genuinely happy. I was not sure the East was ever going to do that for her. The East had too many walls, Ruby had told her mother, and her mother had held her face in both hands and looked at her with the pride that only a mother can produce. And then they had embraced, and Ruby had not cried because she was Ruby, but it had been a near thing. Sitting on the porch that evening with Harvey, she told him what her mother had said, and he listened and then put his arm around her, and she leaned into him with the ease of years of learning each other. And they sat in the evening quiet of the Wyoming land they both belonged to now. In 1883, a second child arrived. This one was also a boy, which surprised Ruby because she had been somehow convinced this one would be a daughter, though she told Harvey afterward that she did not know why she had thought that, since clearly her instincts in the matter were not reliable. They named him Thomas, after old Tom Haskell, who had taught Ruby to ride and who was still on the ranch though moving more slowly now. And Tom received the honor with the silent, gruff pleasure of a man who does not know what to do with being moved and so does nothing, which everyone understood. Sam Greer's health declined through the winter of 1883 and into 1884 with the gradual, dignified diminishment of a man who has lived well and has no outstanding regrets. He spent his days in his chair by the window when the weather kept him inside, and on the porch when it did not, and Harvey or Ruby was always nearby, and the evenings were still shared with coffee and conversation, though shorter now, because Sam tired more easily. He died in April of 1884, quietly in the room he had always had, with the east window open to let in the spring air because he had told Ruby that he liked the way the air smelled in April, and she had made sure the window was open. Harvey sat with him in the last hours, and Ruby came in and out, and there was nothing dramatic about it, only the peaceful completion of a life that had been lived with integrity and now concluded with the same quality. They buried him on the ranch, on the low hill to the south where the view was what he had loved most about the land he had built his life on, with the whole of the Rocking G's people gathered, and several of the neighboring ranch families who had known Sam for decades. Tom Haskell spoke a few plain words that were more moving than any formal eulogy could have been, because they were Tom and therefore entirely without ornament and entirely true. Harvey stood at the graveside with Ruby beside him and his two small sons at their feet and looked at the land that was now, as Sam had arranged, properly theirs, and felt the full weight of the gift and the responsibility of it together, which seemed right because things of real value always carry both. The Rocking G continued. That was the fact of it, the simple, enduring fact. The work went on and the seasons turned and the boys grew. Samuel at 6 was reading with a fluency that made Ruby quietly fierce with pride, and at 7 was already asking Harvey questions about the ranch management, with an attention to detail that suggested he had inherited both his parents' organized minds and had combined them into something that might eventually surpass either. Thomas at 4 was his brother's devoted shadow, and also, already, the person most likely to make everyone in the household laugh at unexpected moments, because he had an instinct for the comic timing of small observations that seemed to be entirely his own invention. Harvey managed the expanded ranch with a confidence that had grown from experience, and Ruby continued to be the center around which everything organized itself, not because she demanded it, but because she was constitutionally incapable of leaving things in disorder, and people naturally oriented toward her steadiness. She had stopped wearing gloves altogether by 1880, except in deep winter, and her hands were strong and capable, and she had never once missed the white silk gloves she had arrived in. One evening in the summer of 1885, Harvey came in from the range later than usual, tired in the bone-deep way of a day that had asked for everything, and found Ruby in the kitchen with a lamp burning and 2 cups of coffee already poured, and the boys in bed, and the house quiet around her. She looked up when he came in and handed him the coffee with the natural ease of someone who has learned another person's needs over years until they are as familiar as their own. He sat down and drank the coffee, and she sat across from him, and they talked through the day in the way they always did, the practical things first and then the larger ones. And he told her about a conversation he had had with a younger man who was looking for work, a man who reminded Harvey of himself at 22, moving through the West following opportunity and not yet knowing what he was actually looking for. "Did you hire him?" Ruby asked. "I told him to come back in the morning," Harvey said. "I wanted to ask you," she looked at him. "You are asking me." "I am asking you," he said. "I always ask you." She smiled, the full version, the one that still made the ground shift. "Yes," she said, "hire him. He sounds like someone who needs a place to be for a while." "He does," Harvey agreed. She looked at him across the lamplit table in the kitchen that had been hers since her first morning in the house that was theirs by the gift of a good man's foresight on the land they had built their life on, and said, "We have done all right, Harvey Dawson." "We have done more than all right," he said. "The stove still drafts to the left in a north wind," she said. "It does," he agreed. "I compensate," she said. "You always do," he said. And it was not just the stove she was talking about, and they both knew it, because she had been compensating and adapting and finding solutions, and building something real from the first morning. She set foot in Wyoming territory with her silk-ribboned hat and her organized mind, and her absolute refusal to be less than she was. And the thing she had built included this man across the table who had been wrong about her in 12 seconds, and had spent the rest of his life being corrected into something better by the fact of who she turned out to be. He reached across the table and took her hand, the strong, capable hand with the gold and garnet ring on it that had been there since the winter of 1878, and held it in the lamp light. "7 years," he said. "7 good years," she said. "The next 7," he said, "and the 7 after that." She turned her hand in his and held back with the same steady certainty she had always had, the certainty that was not confidence in the absence of difficulty, but confidence in the presence of it, the kind that comes from knowing who you are and knowing what you have and trusting both completely. "All of them," she said. "Every one." Outside, the Wyoming night was enormous and brilliant with stars, the kind of sky that had been there before any of them and would be there long after, indifferent in the way of nature, but somehow, on a night like this, with a lamp burning in a kitchen window and a man and a woman sitting across a table with their hands joined, not indifferent at all, generous almost, as though the land itself, vast and hard and honest, had decided that these two people had earned the life they had made in it. The stagecoach that had brought Ruby Wallace to Laramie in the spring of 1878 had long since made its 10,000th trip and would make 10,000 more, carrying other people toward other lives they could not yet imagine. But Ruby's journey had ended exactly where it was supposed to end, and Harvey Dawson, who had watched her step off that coach with her white gloves and her organized mind, and her absolute readiness for everything the frontier intended to offer, who had decided in 12 seconds and been wrong in the most complete and life-altering way a man can be wrong, was the living proof that the best things that ever happen to a person are the things they did not know to expect. The ranch was quiet, the boys slept, the lamp burned steady, the coffee was good. It had always been going to be this. They had simply needed to find their way to it, which they had together, one impossible and perfectly inevitable day at a time. Young Samuel stirred in his sleep and called out for his mother, the way children do in the night when the world feels briefly uncertain, and Ruby rose from the table with the unhurried certainty of someone who knows exactly where she is needed and exactly how to get there. And Harvey watched her go and heard her voice through the wall, low and steady, the same voice that had talked a frightened horse through a thunderstorm years ago, the same voice that had said obvious yes on a wagon seat in November snow. And the voice settled the boy back into sleep with the easy authority of love that does not need to be loud to be felt. She came back to the kitchen and sat down and picked up her coffee cup and looked at Harvey with those dark eyes that had been seeing him clearly for 7 years and would see him clearly for all the years that remained. "He is fine," she said. "I know," Harvey said. "He always is." And what he meant and what she knew he meant and what required no further words between two people who had spent 7 years learning exactly how to hear each other, was not only that the boy was fine, but that all of it was fine. The life they had built, the land they tended, the love they had grown from a stubborn wrong impression, and a kitchen full of coffee, and the particular grace of a woman who had come to the frontier and proved, before the first breakfast was finished on the first morning, that she had always already been exactly where she was supposed to be.